All right, I think it's a good time to get started again. Up next, we've got Lars. How do I pronounce your last name?
Trieloff.
Trieloff. Did I do it okay?
Perfect.
Oh, right on. Yesterday, Lars gave an awesome talk at Lightning Talk at Serverless Conf, which I've been lucky to get to, which I recommend checking out because it's in his tweet stream. I'm not sure how this is going to involve a sweet hipster bike, but it is. Give it up for Lars.
Yeah. Okay. So hello, my name is Lars. I would like to talk about Adobe I/O and answer the question that has been lingering in your head since this morning. So first of all, Adobe I/O, that's a website, and you can visit it at adobe.io. But the more important part is that Adobe I/O is a way for developers to get access to all the things that Adobe is providing, right? And most of you are familiar with the Adobe Creative Cloud, and this is this cloud-shaped icon in the left. In addition to Adobe Creative Cloud, we also have Adobe Document Cloud, which is this Acrobat throwing something around shaped icon in the middle. And finally, Adobe Experience Cloud, which is really offerings for enterprises to better create customer experiences, right? Including advertising, including analytics, including digital marketing. And the thing that is common to all of these is that they're about digital experiences that are based on content and data that are somehow made intelligent through what we call Adobe Sensei. And in order to provide not just APIs for Document Cloud, for Creative Cloud, and for Experience Cloud, but to make them easily accessible and to make them easy to use for developers, we are working on something that we call the Adobe Developer Ecosystem. And this is essentially what Adobe I/O is about. And there are four key parts to this. There's APIs, there's Adobe IO Events, there's the Adobe IO Runtime, and finally the Adobe IO Developer Console. And I would like to go through each of these really quick and show you what they are good for, and then show you how we can put all of this together in a real application. So the first challenge with APIs is APIs in general are fantastic, right? The problem is there are just so many of them, and it's really hard to get information about them. It's really hard to get and manage all the API keys. It's really hard to find out how your application is doing. And this is really the case for a company like Adobe that has a really large product portfolio of more than 100 products, right? Which means we have more than 100 APIs that are managed, or that used to be managed, in more than 100 different ways. So in order to fix this, we said, let's have one API gateway that is handling all API traffic for Adobe. And this is really what Adobe I/O is about, right? It's about one place for documentation on Adobe I/O. It's about one place or one domain that you make your API request to, which is Adobe I/O. And it's one place where you have a developer console where you can register API keys, get access to your applications, register applications. And again, that's on Adobe I/O. The way it works is you have an application. That application makes requests, HTTP requests to Adobe IO API Gateway, which then handles authentication, security, load balancing, throttling, logging, and is also doing the hard work of translating between all the incompatible APIs, marketing APIs, document APIs, creative APIs through adapters, so that all you have to deal with is really HTTP or HTTPS in particular and JSON, making it a bit easier, and on top of that, giving you two easy ways. Well, let me correct that. Giving you two standardized ways to authenticate, including OAuth and JWT. And now you realize why I've been correcting myself on the easy part. So, but this is not all that we do. The second part is what we call Adobe IO Events. And Adobe IO Events is really about making integrations not just possible, but to make them fast. Right? When you look at the traditional RESTful request response pattern, it's really fantastic, unless you are hitting issues with scale, where you have to pull thousands of resources. Right? Imagine trying to find out if files in Creative Cloud storage have changed. Right? You don't want to be in a situation where you pull every single file that is in Creative Cloud. And I said earlier, we have throttling in the API Gateway, so you won't even be in a position where this is possible. Right? Then with polling, you always have the problem of speed. You can either poll too infrequently, which is affecting user experience, or too frequently, which is affecting application load and is going to make you hit rate limits. And finally, you have to essentially do state management, right? So the question is, have I already pulled that resource? What if the API is not answering? Do I retry? So sooner or later, you're building queues, and that's not fun either. So what we are doing instead is we're turning this around through an event-based system. So the way it works is your application can subscribe to events on the Adobe IO API or Event Gateway. So this means you subscribe, you can say, hey Adobe IO, whenever a file is uploaded in Creative Cloud, please let me know. And please let me know through a webhook that you make it, through a webhook that means a post request that you're making to a certain URL that I'm providing you with. And again, Adobe IO handles authentication, security, subscription management, throttling, aggregation. So making sure that you get all the events that you are subscribed to and none of the events that somebody else has subscribed to. And on top of that, it's providing the right adapters for the backend APIs. Right? So we do have APIs within Adobe that are really event-based and push-based, which is fantastic. Because we simply have to translate between two event types. But we also have internal APIs that are really just polling based. So what happens is we do the polling for you, and you don't have to do the polling yourself. And this means with Adobe IO Events, you can really listen to things that are happening. I already mentioned Creative Cloud files. So you can get notified when a user is uploading a file to Creative Cloud. We have the same thing for our enterprise customers with Adobe Experience Manager Assets. And we are working on having support for Adobe Analytics events, which is really cool because it means you will be able to trigger events when a visitor on the website is showing a particular behavior. Right? So the typical example is when somebody puts something into the shopping cart and then leaves the site without checking out. Right? What you want to do then is, in many cases, you just want to send an email if that customer is registered and say, you know what, you just left your shopping cart in the store, and doing garbage collection on all these virtual shopping carts is so hard. We give you a 20% coupon instead. But you can imagine other things like having targeted advertising based on that information. And one of the things that I mentioned is with Adobe IO Events, the way it works is you subscribe to an event, and then you point that event to a particular, essentially, microservice that is handling the webhook. The problem with this is you still have to write a microservice. You still have to operate a microservice. You still have to deploy it. You still have to spin up either a server somewhere or a virtual machine somewhere or a container somewhere. And that's not really fun, right? So we all know once the code has been written, the real work starts, and that's the kind of work that we typically like to offload to operations people. So for things that are really lightweight, right, like handling an event or tying two API requests together, you want to have something that is a bit more lightweight than a full-blown server to run a microservice. And aside from the slightly misplaced frame here, this is what the Adobe IO Runtime is all about. So the Adobe IO Runtime is a serverless runtime that is natively integrated with Adobe IO APIs. Right? So it means you can write Node.js code that is running on Adobe's admittedly, virtual servers. You scale on a function-by-function basis. So you can basically take a single JavaScript file, just put it into GitHub. It will automatically be deployed into the Adobe IO Runtime. And on top of that, because the Adobe IO Runtime is based on Apache OpenWhisk, which is an open source serverless runtime, you can test all of this locally, so there's no lock-in at all. And in fact, you can take the same code that is running on the Adobe IO Runtime and, for instance, deploy it into IBM's Cloud Functions or into whatever Red Hat's version of OpenWhisk is. Another cool thing about the Adobe IO Runtime is that it's pre-integrated with Adobe APIs, right? So the runtime knows who you are as a developer, so it can pre-authenticate all API requests you are making, which is again reducing the overhead that you spend with dealing with things like figuring out how to get a JWT token to get access to the APIs. So how does it work? There are essentially three key ways how you can use this. Number one is, again, your application is making a request to a function. This function is calling another API, let's say the Marketing Cloud API, and transforming the response somehow, and then sending you back a response. So that is option number one. Option number two is you can have functions that are simply invoked and triggered by an event. So Adobe IO Events detects that something has changed in Creative Cloud, in Analytics, in Adobe Experience Manager, sends an event to a function, and this function itself can then make other API calls. So the last thing that is really interesting is, of course, one function can call another function. Right? So you can compose functions into more complex applications, which means the code for a given function stays really, really small and really elegant, but you can reuse it and combine it in really interesting ways. So that's what the Adobe IO Runtime is about. In addition to the Adobe IO framework, we also have Adobe Sensei. And Adobe Sensei is really about bringing intelligence into Adobe's products. We believe that intelligent features are something that we are going to see in a lot of, not just in a lot of Adobe products, but in a lot of products in general. And we want to make it easier for our developers to build these intelligent services, to deploy these intelligent services. But on the other hand, we also want to make it easy for you as developers to consume these through what we call Adobe Sensei APIs or Adobe Sensei services. So again, these are services that operate on content and data, whether they're about computational creativity, enlightened experiences, content cognition. The basic idea is always the same. It's intelligence for experiences, and it's using machine learning, deep learning, all the stuff that you typically read in the news. So all based on a common framework for doing things like building and training models, managing models, serving and scaling models. So now the interesting question is, okay, what is this bike doing here? And what does this have to do with PhoneGap? I would like to show you a quick demo that we built as soon as my Mac lets me. Perfect. So let's not get distracted by Twitter, because so we built a small application with PhoneGap called We Ride, as you might see on the bike, to demonstrate how all of that can be put together. So it's using things like geolocation, like QR code scanning, and no, I don't have a QR code here. So I can see a ride in a bike share, see, oh yeah, it's just 10 meters from here. So let's start the ride and see what is going to happen then. And Nick, that's your clue. I'm really riding this bike.
Thank you.
Oh, hello, I'm back. So, what do you think? How many stars for that ride? 5 stars. So that's the perfect ride. And now, and that's the really fascinating thing, you might have seen this push notification that I've gotten through Line Messenger. Line Messenger is basically WhatsApp in Japanese. Extremely popular there, and I think I wrote a bit too fast. and being used to actually conduct business. So what is happening here is my WeRide account is connected to my Adobe Campaign profile. Adobe Campaign is a solution that is being used, for instance, for email marketing. And based on my profile, they know that I don't like beer, I don't like coffee, but I really like green tea and matcha latte. So this is exactly, what's this? Oh, there's my screen going to sleep. This is exactly the offer that they're pushing to me. So the question is, how does this pushing actually happen? And the basic idea is we have really 3 parts here, right? We have on the one hand the connected bike. The connected bike can communicate on the one hand with the cloud and with the mobile device, either through Bluetooth or through QR codes or through simply GPS and GSM. Then we have on the mobile phone the WeRide app, which is a PhoneGap app. And the key thing that the PhoneGap app does here is it's making a simple request to Notify.js. And Notify.js is a function that is running within the Adobe IO Runtime. And this function itself is then communicating with Adobe Campaign and the Line API to actually send this push message. So sending a push message itself is not really that interesting. You can do that out of the box. Sending a push message that is connected to your consumer profile that you have in Adobe Campaign, that is connected to an app that is already installed and where the customer has already established trust with the brand, and doing that without having to operate or run any servers. That's really exciting. That's really interesting. So with that being said, there's a lot more to find out about Adobe I/O. The best place to find things out about Adobe I/O is on Adobe I/O. And that's all I'm going to say for now. Thank you.
Yay.